Chers collègues, chers membres d'ICOM, chers participants, asseyez-vous.
Dear members of ICOM, dear colleagues, please do take a seat as our speaker, Luís Raposo, is now online. And it would be good if we could sit down to listen to him. Let me check where Vincent Négri is as well for our next talk. Could we please launch the video? Good morning, Luís. Good afternoon. Sorry, Luís. Delighted to have you here with us. I do apologize for keeping you waiting. We are running slightly behind schedule, but we have managed to catch up a little bit. People are just coming back from lunch now. I'm going to hand over to you imminently, but let me introduce you. You're an archaeologist, member of the executive board of ICOM, and vice president of the Portuguese Association of Archaeologists. Previously, you were president of ICOM Europe. I am delighted to be succeeding you in this function. You were director of the National Museum of Archaeology in Portugal and professor of literature in Lisbon University. We will be listening to you now for this afternoon session on what does belonging mean. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for this introduction. So I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. I followed the very technical and very documented presentations this morning. My approach is a professional and citizens approach. And a professional approach, obviously, it's quite simple at the end of the day. I am going to start by responding to the question that we will be asking this afternoon. Is it enough to acquire an object or a collection for it to belong to us? Very briefly and very frankly, I would say no, that's not enough. But we do need to take the time to sit down and ask another question. What do we have to be at the origin of an object for it to belong to us? I don't think that's true either. So this nuance here regarding whether or not something belongs to us, I'm going to be asking 6 questions for one reflection. So I think that for many of you, for most of you even, these may seem like quite banal, everyday questions, but I apologize for my simplicity, but these are questions that are of concern to us as museum professionals, and particularly as citizens as well. So would you be able to launch my presentation slides, please? So the first question is about the legality of incorporation. So was this incorporated before or after the international law on purchasing and selling artwork? Was the collection stolen? Was it donated? Was it purchased? These are questions that we're going to be asking. In any case, we don't necessarily have any answers to give. I'm going to be asking a lot of questions. In my opinion, all collections stolen after legal order was established as part of the United Nations system must be restituted immediately. For collections that have been gifted or acquired in past centuries, with the exception of coercive contacts, I do not see any reason why they should be returned to their origin as an overall solution in any case, unless otherwise required to. So let me give you an example. Tens of thousands of objects were stolen during the American occupation of Baghdad in Iraq. As you know, a large number of those have not yet been returned. And even last year, 2 years ago, 20,000 were returned to the Museum of Baghdad, which has been able to reopen its doors to the public, but there are still a number of objects that need to be returned. Second example, but then on the other extreme example, I'm trying to give you very extreme examples so that we can have this reflection between two different streams of thought. There are thousands and thousands of cases to consider. But what about the obelisks or the needles? We have around 25 in the world, these pharaoh obelisks, and only 5 are still in Egypt, and only 4 remain in their exact place of origin. The others are spread across Europe and across North America. So the one that Cleopatra gifted to Caesar is in the People's Square, Plaza del Popolo in Rome. Should it be returned to its origin? I don't think so, but this is the extreme opposite perspective around this question. The next question, collection conditions. Is it a scientific mission? Was it a military campaign? Have the objects and collections been used by the authors or owners? Have they been abandoned? Were they created intentionally to sell to researchers or tourists? Next slide. Let's give another 2 extreme examples. The bronze of Benin. Of course, in my opinion, they need to be returned. The Benin bronzes. This was a punitive military campaign. And as I understand in my perspective of the contemporary world, is not acceptable. And these artworks need to be returned as they are starting to be returned. But another example in Portugal, in the Ethnological Museum, we have collections, iconic collections from Brazil, such as this one. This was collected in the 1960s as part of a scientific campaign. These are the masks of the Waja, currently located in Lisbon. The original authors, creators of these masks, pierced the eyes of the masks so that they would no longer be symbolic objects, so that they are just like dolls at the end, so that Europeans could have them in their museums and their collections. So should these masks be returned to their origin if someone one day claims them? I don't think so. Next question. Definition of the feeling of belonging. This is perhaps a complex question. Are current people really heirs of the original authors? Is there an effective historical continuity? That's a real important question when we are digging deeper. Let me give 2 extreme examples again. In the USA, a representative of the first American Indian population, 7,500 years BC, was discovered. This is the skull of Kenwick. There have been a number of contradictory legal decisions made. This is a Native American. We are all descendants of Adam and Eve, after all. It's very complex, and it's very doubtful that we've been able to identify the true descendants of this individual. So I do not accept that this was then destroyed for burial. I think that this is a contemporary folly. On the other hand, we have another example. This is the padrão. It's a narrative marker that the Portuguese, particularly, and also Spanish people placed in the lands that they discovered. This is in Namibia, modern-day Namibia. It was there as a marker of the first Europeans arriving in the region. It was taken from Lisbon and then sculpted on site in Namibia. It was then transported to Berlin until very recently. The Museum of Berlin then decided to return it to Namibia. But this is a Portuguese object originally. So should it have been returned to Namibia? I don't know. Or to Portugal? I don't think it should have been returned to Portugal. This is an object that only makes sense in the specific location in which it was left by the Portuguese. Fourth question is about the very nature of collections. Even if legally obtained and even if we understand them as scientific, there is a question about whether objects can exist in museums or laboratories, which, given modern day ethics, would be a serious infraction of social norms and the dignity of human life. So another example is the Venus, which is already offensive. The Venus Hottentot has been returned to South Africa, and I think that that is very important. This was a matter of human dignity, even though at the time it was collected at a time when the values were very different. But here we have another example. This is the opposite. And I have some doubts here. This is the Lombroso man in Italy. The physical anthropology at the time had studies into skulls, and they were trying to find personality traits reflected in the skulls. These were collected as an expression of this research. More recently, there has been a movement by the extreme right saying that it's not acceptable to have this man. We know his name, we know his family descendants, and the question was raised. A tribunal, a court in Italy, and the ICOM Global Ethics Committee studied this issue, and they believed that the object here, the man, should remain in the museum. I have doubts about that decision, very frankly, because this is an individual who is well known, with a name, with a history, with a family, still living. This is a question. This is a European. So the question that we have in the US for Native Americans, not for Black people, but for Native Americans in this case, need to be taken into account. But these were not considered to be relevant questions for this case in Italy. The fifth question is about thinking about icons of identity. History is what it is within a specific context. There's a common perception of this, and the construction of mythologies for each present seem to be quite random. There will therefore always be claims that certain objects or pieces within a museum, even if they have been legitimately obtained, should be returned to their origins because they are essential emblems of the people who made them or who feel like they should inherit them. So let me give you some example. The friezes in the Parthenon, should they be returned to Greece? They were legitimately obtained and taken to the British Museum. In my opinion, they should be returned now because they are a key, essential parts of the identity of Greek people. Final question. What is the end destination? This is a very sensitive matter once again. So the final destination after return, museums and societies in colonial metropolitan areas believe that it's not their fault. Is it actually true? If we mean that these colonial metropolitan areas should not require perfect conservation and security conditions, but instead should contribute to creating them within a destiny, then yes, I think we true. But if the final destination, the final purpose of this is not just to conserve them and exhibit them to the public, if it's a private collection, for instance, or if it's a reintroduction, whether that be legal or illegal, into the art market, this has already happened many times. It's even more difficult in these cases. This has already raised a lot of questions, and we can see on the next slide, I continue with the most difficult question. It gets worse. How about if it's just simple destruction in the name of consumption or rituals that had not been finished at the moment that it was captured by colonialists? Anybody defending the paradigm of the Enlightenment, including museums, they are an expression of this, needs to learn about what it would mean to return to the Dark Ages, where we had the destruction of what we called scientific or museum collections. So, for example, the skull or a mask that would be destroyed as part of a ritual consumption. Do I believe that that is good? I do not think that that is the time or mode in which I was born or the one in which I would like to live. That's everything that I have to say. Thank you. Thank you very much, Luís. I do not know if you are still online with us, but thank you for this beautiful, this excellent introduction into this question that we introduced almost naively. What does it mean to have collections belong to us? So thank you for your serious research into this presentation. This is going to serve as a baseline for what Vincent Négri is now going to continue with. So thank you, Luís. I do not know how you will be organizing the roundtable, but I'm going to hand over to Vincent Négri in any case.
Bonjour à toutes et tous. Donc,
Good afternoon, everybody. This is going to have be quite an interesting session, as we're going to have a number of participants by video conference. Perhaps we could already have one of the participants come join me on stage so that I feel a little bit less isolated up here.
Donc, on va se pencher aujourd'hui.
So this afternoon, we're going to be looking at two notions. They're quite unique. So this is within the title of today's events. These two notions are about acquiring or belonging. They do seem to have a direct relationship, but there's a fluid transition from acquiring an object to having ownership of it. Acquisition is an expression of will, whereas this term belong or belonging is the concretization, the realization of having ownership, ownership as a legal expression of property relating to the belonging. So we're going to be thinking about some of the questions that we've been asking since this morning and taking a different angle in our discussion of them. We are going to look at a number of different disciplines, whether history, anthropology, and law. We have this question which is going to underpin this session. You can see this on the screen now. it's not just a mirroring between acquiring and belonging. There's a matter of law and ownership. In the title, it says, is it enough to acquire an object for it to belong to us? Belong has been placed in quotation marks. And when I look at this, I would have perhaps placed the quotation marks around us. Who has this ownership? Who has this belonging? Can we share this belonging? So I'm going to introduce this round table with 3 points. Firstly, acquisition and belonging are two notions that cover a plurality of meaning. Do we agree with what these terms mean and what we think they mean? The second is about being tied to an environment, a community. And in another register, it's a relationship expressing that some objects, that there's an affiliation with certain objects or collections, an attribution. In terms of law, this is mirrored with the concept of property. We started to see that this morning. This is a principle without much flexibility, and I will come back to that. Acquisition is about a transfer towards oneself, so I can acquire knowledge. More frequently, more commonly, it's a material act about purchasing, acquiring something. Within the legal sphere, it's the act by which a transfer or access to property is obtained. Within this legal field, whether you have to pay or whether it's free, has an impact on this qualification of the transfer of property as an acquisition. A number of ancient authors, including Benjamin Constant, was able to define acquisition. Benjamin Constant was in the 18th and 19th century, believed that acquisition is of great importance today. We have talked a lot about restitution earlier, so I'm not going to come back to that now. But he says that acquisition is legitimate ownership. It's different from the violent conquest of an object which we take. Man who has enriched himself by property and knowledge is different from someone who has spoiled and ravaged a land. Benjamin Constant adds that spoiling the weaker makes it illegitimate ownership. So looting or spoiling is going to lead me into my second point, the relationship between acquisition and belonging, which is positioned on a hinge, which is property. Property is a legally loaded term, as we saw this morning in the West. It is a conception which we share, but this is not universal, as we saw this morning. We will be coming back to that point. And I do not need to convince you of the non-universal nature of property. You can just look at the languages of different peoples and communities and think about how we name, what we call this notion of owning an object. Let's come back to our conceptions now. In our Western conception, property is an exclusivist concept. Goods are owned by a single owner who is able to exercise full control over that good. This is just so that you can understand this. So there is an article in the French Civil Code which expresses this model in quite a radical format. Ownership is the right of having absolute enjoyment of goods or property as long as it is not in contradiction to the law. So property is excluding others from enjoyment of goods. And this is within the register of private property, where we see the true clout of this. On the other hand, public property has a cardinal nature in order to transcend private property for common use. And we'll come back to this notion of collectivity, collective use. Public property can also produce a paradigm of exclusion if we are talking about responding to claims from a third country. The public collection leads us to this notion of cultural sovereignty, which I will come back to later. Public property and the law of public collections are mirrored with the title of this roundtable. There is the notion of public domain, which we heard about this morning with the Claire Chastagnier, with the inalienability, imprescriptibility. This law, this notion, acts as an anchor within our collections. These rules are not exorbitant. Although the law locks in the availability of collections, there's a dual rule with inalienability. It enables access by the public to collections. Public collections are not special, they're not an exclusivist model. They place an obligation in the public authorities to ensure access to what constitutes cultural heritage in the nation. Let's look at this in another way. There's this dichotomy, a radical dichotomy between the private ownership and public property. This dichotomy consists of producing that if we reject one, then we end up in the other. This is a dichotomy that leads us to question the collective use of public property. So public property presupposes the notion of a public good. And these terms have concentrated the problem of common and collective use and have strangled the development and prevented the development of other models. Talking about these models now, this is my final point. This is about us, the us that we see in the title, for it to belong to us. So, in other words, what about law? How is law distributed with regard to public collections? We can see what was said previously. We might think that the problem has been solved. A collective ownership requires legal framework so that we do not leave public collections to go into a private collection. It is outside of potential commercial networks and in principle is inalienable. This dynamic has a limitation. There is governance by members of the community who acts on their behalf. There's this issue of governance where the us is placed within this title. In our system, the recognition and knowledge of collective use are absorbed within ownership by the public. So this session will be focusing on us, and we are needing to look at the notion of collective use, more exactly, collective uses or common uses. And this is where the notion of plurality is so important. We have a legal framework in place, and we need to be thinking about legal plurality. there's a number of different uses or utilities when talking about the sovereignty of an individual. Alice Fabrice will be speaking later, and I'm sure that she will talk about diffuse legal framework in Brazil. So this feeling of belonging can be expressed by distinct communities that are not the state or by public authorities. And this can be at play in the international sphere. This is the principle of sovereignty, which expresses the unique needs of a single state to the exclusion of other states. Let me very quickly mention something about this. The balance of our international society, what we could call the international social contract, is based on the following postulate. This is that each state consents to respecting the limit that others' sovereignty imposes on its own. Let me finish with two observations on this link between acquire and belong. When talking about the sole sovereignty of states with the power that they have, they are not above the other, they are not in competition with the others. This seems to have been resolved. There is a movement in favor of a new balance and a new reading of this social contract. We can see a displacement of the center of gravity, which has been recognized by recognizing cultural rights of a community. We can see the substance within this as well. My final point, before I introduce the fellow members, is about a tragic issue. In 2021, there was a legal case about Crimea and Ukraine. 26th of October 2021, this was before the current war began. We can see that collective utility may be formed when there is a problem with the notion of ownership and property. In Amsterdam, they identified the sovereignty, legal sovereignty of the state. This was about the operation of a site. I think Crimean museums loaned these in 2014 before this was annexed by Russia. The question was whether it should be restituted to the Museum of Crimea or to the Crimean state, Ukrainian state, sorry. And the solution was to restitute them to the Ukrainian state. So this is about the sovereignty of the Ukrainian people. I have attempted to give you a few ideas in order to ask this question. I'm delighted now to be able to invite my colleague to join me, some friends, Manlio Frigo, who is Professor of Law at the University of Milan. Good afternoon, Manlio, who will be talking about property, possession and sovereignty in international law. I will also have the chance of handing over to Alice Lopez Fabrice, whose thesis I was able to direct. She is a Doctor of Law and works in Brazil and Chile. I will also be talking about to Paz Núñez-Regueiro, who will be talking about the WAMPU and diplomacy. I was very interested in what you were saying about that when we had the opportunity to discuss it previously. We will be able to wrap up this roundtable with two researchers from CNRS, Véronique Moulinier and Sylvie Sagne, who will be asking a slightly unusual question. And this might help us to think about a collection and depossession. So I can see Véronique is already connected online. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Manlio, who will be speaking from Milan.
Yes, good afternoon. Good afternoon to Vincent and to all of you, to all of the delegates who are here. I'm sorry not to be with you in person, but I'm isolating at the moment, so I cannot even leave my house right now. I hope that technology is going to help us. I can see that you already have the presentation that I sent. Yes, indeed we do. So the task that Vincent gave me is quite a difficult one because he's already said almost everything there is to say around the idea of ownership, possession, and sovereignty. And particularly the question that has been asked, is it enough to acquire an object to own it? I don't know if I have the answer to this question. I don't want to bore you with academic or theoretical discussion about the ideas of sovereignty and ownership, which are legal notions which you probably are not that interested to hear me talking about, particularly if you are somebody assisting from ICOM. But I nonetheless want to remind you that when we talk about sovereignty and ownership, we are talking about legal concepts that are actually fairly different and separate. Sovereignty is a question of international law, and it's a concept that has a dual character. When I say that, I mean that when we talk about sovereignty, it means that the state exercises authority over a people and a given territory. But on the other hand, there is an external aspect, which is the fact that the state is not subordinated to any other entity. And this idea of external sovereignty is linked to the strict notion of sovereign equality between states in the international community. Roman ancestors would say that the sovereignty comes from the rule of the emperor over the territory, and that ownership is about dominion, and it's an exclusive concept. Ownership or propriety is not just a public notion. It can be something that applies to the private domain. Vincent talked quite a bit about public ownership. Sovereignty, again, doesn't only refer to the public domain. So the two concepts are not opposed. They're rather complementary. Let us talk a bit more closely about our subject. We need to think about the idea of belonging. We need to move on to the next slide. With respect to the protection of cultural objects, international law does not affect prerogatives of sovereignty or even ownership, propriety in a strict sense. You may know of the example of the list under the UN Convention of 1972, the World Heritage State list, the places or objects that are defined as World Heritage Sites. So you can have city centres or monuments on the list of World Heritage Sites. There's been no invasion by the international organizations. So the issue of sovereignty or public or private ownerships is a separate matter altogether. So once again, international law it does not, in principle, affect the area which we are working in. Let's move on to the next slide, because we can talk about the issue of belonging through an analysis of the concept of illicit trafficking, because this phenomenon of illicit trafficking of cultural assets leads us to the questions of belonging, sovereignty, and ownership. Here is an attempt to define what illicit trafficking is. It is the import, export, or transfer of goods in breach of national or international rules which seek to protect the ownership of cultural aspects, which may aim to preserve their integrity. And here, this broader concept of belonging, it aims to preserve link with a state community or a specific territorial community. It's not necessarily linked to the idea of state sovereignty. Nonetheless, the rules of international law in our area tend to seek to protect links which are not just to do with state sovereignty, but this is where we talk about the concept of diffuse interest that Vincent was talking about. This definition talks about a determined territorial community. So this concept of illicit trafficking may cover stolen goods, and so we're talking about ownership. We might talk about cultural items that are illegally exported in breach of national protection laws, and there might be a third category. These are cultural assets which have been legally taken out of a territory but were not returned at the originally planned date to the country of origin. So these comments lead us to have a look at another aspect which is relevant to the issue of illicit trafficking. If we look at international data on the circulation of cultural assets and the aim of combating illicit trafficking, we come across two different concepts, the notion of restitution and the idea of return. These are two different categories or different definitions, because restitution should be guaranteed and on behalf of the owner of a cultural asset that has been stolen. The issue of return, the notion of return should be used for an item that has been illicitly exploited from a particular state territory. So in the first case, the legitimate owner was robbed and is asking for the item to be restituted. In the second case, we're not talking about theft, probably. In this case, the breach or violation might have been an illegitimate export. In other fields, you will see a very clear distinction in this. For example, in the Hague Convention of 1954 concerning cultural assets in the case of conflict army, there's also the UNESCO Convention of 1970. And if we move on to the next slide, there is also the 1995 Unidroit Convention, where you have probably the clearest definition here you have the first article of this convention, which states that the convention refers to two types of situations: the restitution of stolen cultural assets and the repatriation of cultural assets that have been moved from one state's territory in breach of its law concerning the export of cultural assets. Even in European law, I'm sure you know this famous Directive 2014-60 about the restitution of cultural assets that have illegally left member states' territories. Here, once again, the restitution means the material or tangible return of the cultural object to the territory of the requesting member state. What I wanted to highlight is that in this context of international and European law, the common element between these two fairly distinct notions is that you have in both cases a physical transfer of the objects into, for example, the territory of the requesting state, as is the case for the European directive. If we could move on to the next slide, please. It is true that if you look at the case that was presented with this morning, I wasn't actually here to hear it this morning, but there was some discussion of the bill in Belgium that was approved by the Parliament on the 30th of June 2022. Here we have a different context. It's not a context concerning the restitution or return or object in general. It is a specific context, what we're talking about today, the return or restitution of items that are linked to the colonial past of Belgium. And here, for the first time, this is a bit of a standout example. It's different to most international cultural practice. You have these two definitions that are given in the Belgian bill. In this case, restitution is the transfer of the legal ownership of the restituable item determined in accordance with this law. So this is a theoretical transfer of ownership. And then following on from this, return means the physical transfer of the object to the country of origin. So an explanation of the rationale behind this rule has been provided in the preamble to this law in Belgium. It says, in distinguishing the restitution and the physical return of the object to the country of origin, this law is moving away from the principle of Article 350 of the Civil Code. That's actually the same principle as was described earlier, according to which the property rights and the right to use the object and enjoy the object and to dispose of it. In this case, the physical return of the item does not necessarily follow from the theoretical restitution. This is a new definition, I think unprecedented, but it's very interesting because it could raise some problems. As you know, the draft bill provides for bilateral agreements which will need to be entered into between Belgium and the receiving state who's going to receive the object. I think this distinction is very important because this law comes into force within a very specific context, a specific framework. There was a debate that followed the report that was published in Europe, we've seen a number of examples of this, not just of theoretical debates, but some very concrete examples of the desire to settle some of the issues raised by the colonial past. I could just think about Cambridge University in the UK and Aberdeen University in 2021, which returned some bronzes that had been looted from Nigeria by the British Army in southern Nigeria in 1897. Germany and Nigeria has a pre-agreement for the restitution of these well-known Benin bronzes from 2022. Once again, here the Netherlands government has announced its support for the proposal to return looted items from public collections. And in February 2022, the Angolan government started discussions with the Portuguese government concerning the return of some items of cultural heritage from Angola. It's the first example of a law that provides a clear framework for the restitution of items from the colonial past. This way of doing it is quite interesting because there is a new definition. Restitution and return were clear notions in international law, and here the physical return, I suppose, is in question. So here it leads us to raise questions again about ownership and sovereignty and this issue of belonging. As Vincent Négri said to us, the idea of belonging is probably not a legal concept, it's a broader concept. We're talking about protecting sometimes broader interest. Vincent talked to us about collective utility, collective interest. Whose collective interest should be protected? Very useful response has been given to us. The real issue is to understand whether there is any continuity between the current states and the people who were actually looted in the past. That's another issue. Let me finish this presentation by saying that I think that apart from the legal notions, and undoubtedly the judges and courts who will be asked to give answers with respect to return and restitution, the judges will need to use legal categories. Some of these definitions will not necessarily be acceptable from an ethical point of view. Ethics are not the same as the law unless a judge decides to rule on a different basis. But the real question is whether belonging can be dissociated from other concepts, which I think is very important. The possibility of enjoyment of a cultural item. If one accepts that there is a separation between the physical transfer of the item and the right to enjoy the item, I think this could be a starting point which would raise a number of questions which will require responses. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Manlio, de ce...
Thank you very much, Manlio, for this very rich presentation, which might raise some questions about the points that you raised about this idea of sense of belonging and how it can be determined and expressed in legal terms. Perhaps in order to give an initial answer, Alice Lopez Fabrice is going to give us a few brief answers to this question of belonging. Alice, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you very much. I'd like to first of all thank the organisers of this conference. I want to thank Vincent Négri, who's gave me the opportunity to speak during this roundtable. My presentation will be about the participation of Indigenous communities in the management of their heritage. I've focused on the objects from South America. These objects were handed over sometimes involuntarily or sometimes under coercion. These objects had important roles in their culture. These objects are now exhibited in museums, either in their country or abroad. These objects are still part of their culture, and in many situations, they want their claims to be handled or at least listened to. Initially, I would like to give you a brief introduction to the rights of Indigenous people in international law. I would like then to highlight some of the ways these laws are applied in South America, in Brazil and in Chile. So in the first part of my presentation, I would like to show you the state of international law. Following on from case law in some South American countries, the international laws are still the main instrument for the protection of Indigenous people and the basis of national laws. With respect to international law, the first instrument which protects Indigenous people's rights is the ILO Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention number 169. This plays a key role in the protection of Indigenous peoples, but it doesn't have specific measures with respect to the protection of cultural assets of these people. It says that special measures need to be taken by states as necessary in order to protect people, institutions, objects, the work and the environment of the relevant peoples. It requires states to recognize the values and social, cultural, religious and spiritual practices of these peoples, and to take into due consideration the nature of the problems that they face as groups and as individuals. With respect to the idea of belonging or ownership, they talk about ancestral lands, but the key concept is established by Article 6 of this convention, which asks governments to consult the relevant peoples, in particular the representative institution, any time that a legislative or administrative measure might affect them directly. This principle of consultation shall guide the Indigenous peoples in terms of the way their cultural heritage is managed. In 2007, the UN Assembly General adopted a declaration on the rights of Indigenous people. It says that Indigenous peoples have the right to preserve, to control and protect and develop their cultural heritage, their traditional know-how and their traditional cultural expressions and the manifestations of their science, techniques and culture. They also have the right to preserve and control, protect their collective intellectual property linked to this cultural heritage, their traditional knowledge and their traditional cultural expressions. It's useful to note that the rights of Indigenous peoples are considered to be collective. The ownership of their lands belong to the people as a whole. Each people can organize itself in order to decide how to manage its assets. Each time that there are measures that are likely to affect a people, they are to be consulted. When there is a right to return of objects, religious objects, this UN declaration says that states should allow the access for religious items or the repatriation through fair, transparent and efficient mechanisms that are developed in consultation with the indigenous people affected. This covers cultural, religious and spiritual items which might have been previously taken without their prior consent or in breach of their traditional laws or practices or customs. In 2013, a further declaration was adopted by the Organization of American States. This talks about the principle of consent and consultation with respect to items that belong to indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have the right to their own cultural identity and integrity and their cultural heritage, whether tangible or intangible, in particular, their historical and ancestral culture and the protection and preservation of the development of said cultural heritage in order to transmit it to future generations and ensure its collective continuity. This declaration establishes that native peoples should be fully recognized and respected in terms of the ownership and control, the oversight and development of their cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible, over their intellectual property and the collective nature of this heritage that is handed down from generation to generation over thousands of these. So states with the participation of the indigenous people must adopt measures in order to ensure that international national agreements ensure the recognition and the appropriate protection of cultural heritage and the intellectual property linked to indigenous people's cultural heritage. When these laws are adopted, there must be a commitment to consultation in order to ensure free, prior and informed consent on the part of the indigenous peoples. These declarations are recent, but they impose obligations on the state with respect to respecting these rights of the indigenous people. They're not binding, but they're often mentioned in international and national case rule, showing that they do have legal force, even if it is weak. With respect to free, prior, informed consent, FPIC, the international law talks about this principle. It could be said that this is part of international law. It's only in Brazil, in the constitution. Sorry, next slide.
The indigenous people's heritage was formally recognized at this moment. The state needs to protect the manifestations of Afro-Brazilian indigenous peoples and from other participants in national civilization. The state also recognized the diffuse nature of this heritage and a certain quality as well. The global society has a national case law beginning to be established within that. More specifically for indigenous peoples, a social organization, their language, their beliefs and their traditions, and the original law, the original right, to the land that they have lived on has been recognized for indigenous peoples. It's not just for limiting and controlling and respecting all of their goods. This is to support the state and not necessarily the communities, but there is an exclusive ownership by the indigenous communities. Here we can see two different interests: the diffuse interest, which is the interest of the Brazilian society in the protection of this cultural heritage, and a collective interest, which is the interest of the indigenous community in the protection of their cultural heritage. The interest of the Brazilian people belongs to a non-determined number of people, and the collective interest belongs to a determined number of people. there are these diffuse interests. There is this diffuse interest, but it's the collective interest that is going to give the indigenous populations the right to take part in contributing to the protection of their cultural heritage. In terms of application of the protection of the indigenous people's cultural heritage, there is the IFAN order, which mentions the 2007 UN declaration, which talks about the need to establish national policy for tangible cultural heritage. Within this order, it says that along with the UN declaration, indigenous peoples have the right to practice and use their cultural practices and customs. They need to be protected and they have the right to develop past, present, and future expressions of their culture, including ceremonies, technologies, visual arts, literature, and many other items. We can also see that archaeological items are the property of the state, but the archaeological heritage now requires us to involve the indigenous people in the conservation of elements related to their culture. The order also establishes that people who identify as indigenous peoples have the right to identify their own priorities in preservation of their own cultural and tangible heritage. This requires the free, prior, and informed consent of the communities involved. IFAN also needs to consult with the people related, have appropriate procedures, and there are institutions in place whenever anything, a measure could impact them directly. Participation in management of the items that belong to them, even if the formal ownership does not belong to them, can help the indigenous peoples and community. Finally, IFAN, along with people who and communities who identify as indigenous, need to identify a specific cultural heritage preservation and management program for tangible heritage. This is not yet in place, but indigenous peoples already have a technique for preservation of their culture. This is not yet recognized as such. The museum, the Indigenous Museum, is not officially recognized by IFAN. It's in another category, but in order to understand the ideas and the importance of the participation of these communities in the preservation of their culture, we first need to understand the situation facing these communities. We can observe in Brazilian society a movement for the erasure of indigenous culture. For centuries, indigenous peoples have been excluded, have been expulsed from their territories, and this integrationalist policy has continued throughout the 20th century when reserves were created to remove these individuals from their territories and integrate them into Brazilian society. So there is a need to safeguard and protect indigenous culture. The importance of these spaces for preserving their culture is well known, and there's an importance of the participation of these individuals in the preservation of their heritage. This can be shown through the ICOM. In the 1930s, this community was expulsed from its land and they were taken to the indigenous villages of another community in another province. And the preservation of their culture was ensured through the creation of a cultural space. I would like to share the example of the Akam Oram Krenak Museum, where customs were preserved by a number of different objects from the Krenak peoples in this area. Families were then able to attend this space and bring visitors along. This has continued production and has expanded the space because over time, a number of visitors began to visit indigenous peoples. This cultural space saw an increase in visitor numbers, including schools and families. The question of language then was raised among the creators. They then started to look for ancestral songs. This is a space where culture can be preserved and passed down to future generations. They can also tell the story of this time in their own vision, such as the Woki Museum, which was built by 3 indigenous women in their territory. As Chao Olivier has explained, an indigenous museum is more than just a museum. It's a space where we can conserve the memory of a people. It's also a sort of a form of resistance and fighting and struggle. They are managed by the indigenous peoples themselves. They are sometimes outdoors, in the forest, in houses of prayer, in schools, or in buildings that belong to indigenous peoples. They're in perpetual movement. The tangible and intangible come together to tell the story of the objects exhibited. We can identify with an era of indigenous peoples, with issues relating to indigenous peoples, and we see how they conserve the objects related to their culture, which is why it's very important to support them with international instruments. With ethnic cleansing and cultural genocide, there have been attempts to remove their culture. Attempts by law to recognize the need of indigenous people to take part in the preservation of their culture is now present. In 1988, there was the constitution which established a body for the recognition of indigenous peoples in order to recognize, respect, and promote the ancestral practices and culture of indigenous peoples, along with their vision of the world, paying special attention to the development of culture, arts, and indigenous cultural practice. The recognition of cultural heritage was central to this. The new constitution proposes that indigenous peoples have 3 accesses to tangible and intangible heritage along with their institutions. The new constitution recognizes the importance of the cultural importance that can be attributed to nature. And this right is recognized in a number of different countries in South America, such as Ecuador and Bolivia. The next steps in the adoption of this new constitution we won't have time to discuss that today, but we have another mechanism for participation, which is the creation of independent registers for the use, management, and access with regard to indigenous cultural heritage. When talking about external people, these protocols are a practice and a sort of inter-ethnic collaboration at a local level. It's especially relevant for tourism, research, and aspects linked to the dissemination of traditional and indigenous practices. This is the way that these people have found to express themselves and their desires. This is how their history should be told. The direct participation in the consortium of the indigenous community in the management of their heritage is increasingly present in the laws of South American countries. In this sense, management of indigenous culture should be carried out in line with their own practices and in recognition of indigenous peoples. Some people are also fighting for recognition as a people in the current situation. I thank you very much for listening. I finished.
Merci beaucoup, Alice, pour cet exposé très riche et illustré par les...
Thank you very much for this very rich presentation with examples from Brazil and from Chile. This has already given us some food for thought around this question of the diffuse interest, which you differentiated from the collective interest, and the interest that the entire nation has on the one side, and the interest enjoyed by the indigenous community in protection of their heritage. So I'm now going to hand over, with no further ado, to Paz Núñez-Regueiro, who will be talking about the Croyan project, if I'm not mistaken. I have a PowerPoint. I don't know if you're going to be able to show that on the screen. Thank you very much to the organizers of this event for inviting me to take part in these discussions around who collections belong to. I'm going to be sharing some ideas with you from the American unit of research, and we've been doing this for a number of years now with a number of international and French researchers. There are a number of pieces from Canada and the US which were collected in the 17th and 18th century during the first French colonial empire in North America. These pieces were sent to France and have integrated the royal, aristocratic, and ecclesiastic collections before joining the public collections during the Revolution. This is an exceptional corpus composed of pieces of high artistic quality with a number of different types from this immense territory of New France at the time. Some of them are especially interesting as they can be compared with around 20 Native American nations. Because of the great interest of this collection, we launched multidisciplinary international research in order to grow knowledge and to promote and disseminate this. There were a number of different focuses. So we started with multidisciplinarity with a look into the provenance, the origin, and then we had a material study of collections in order to identify the materials and the manufacturing techniques. Better knowledge of this will help us to develop a preservation and restoration protocol that is suitable for these collections. We also want to ensure the long-term sustainability of these objects and to ensure their state so that they can be transported to the communities that created them. Finally, there's collaboration with the indigenous peoples, the places of origin, in order to develop dissemination projects in order to share this authentic know-how. A number of collaborations have been in place. I'm going to be looking at an exhibition with a number of different partners. This is called Wampum. It is Pearls of Diplomacy in New France. This was exhibited last spring. You can see the white pearls created in shells from North Atlantic. This is a very prestigious piece and was used in a number of necklaces. The wampum necklaces were at the heart of diplomacy between the Northeast American territories and France in the 17th and 18th century. This reflects the cultural time and also goes back to the different uses in these ancient times and the contemporary time. It is unique, as for the very first time, it brought together all of the wampum conserved in France. They are exceptional thanks to their seniority and their variety. They are especially rare witnesses of this friendship and hostility and aggression, this long history between France and North America. Research around a wampum and the synopsis of the exhibition were carried out, as I said, in collaboration with a number of partners. Wendat, so these were some of the first settlers in current Quebec, and also Seneca partners. The US is one of the 6 nations working on this. This confederation was a leading part of the colonization in this region and the wars between France and Quebec at this time. The Seneca still have a painful memory of the punitive campaigns carried out in 1687. Another point that is important to note here that the Hodosone is one of the most mobilized nations for the restitution of human remains, and the wampum in their community under the American federal law, NAGRA, which refers to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. One of our partners, Peter Jamieson, was coordinator for over 30 years of these applications for restitution. We raised the question of the legitimacy of these Native American objects which were obtained during our colonial past. Our first meeting was during COVID-19, followed by an event in Paris in October 2021 with Seneca partners, Maroc and Rwanda's partners. We looked at objects conserved at the museum, which reassured indigenous peoples that these were diplomatic gifts. In most cases, there is a lack of use and wear on a lot of the pieces. Yes, these were given during a colonial context, but indigenous peoples were free across their territory at that time. All partners said that these wampum and most of the pieces shown were the fruit of diplomacy and exchange between the countries. This shows how long these relationships have been in place. This was while recognizing the sovereignty of these people and recognizing French colonization in this region. The Seneca partners recognized that the French wampums were perhaps legitimate, and they were delighted to be able to work around these exceptional objects without carrying the weight of having to potentially apply for restitution. And this gave us the opportunity to launch a new kind of discussion around this type of heritage object. That said, the question of to whom these collections belong is still complex and has not been resolved. Inventories do not necessarily specify the cultural ownership of pieces. It only says that it is wampum patterns which were gifted to religious communities in France. This is true for the one that you can see here, which was gifted and is still conserved at the cathedral in France. This is an exceptional piece with the size and the quality. Above all, it's a piece with high emotions for the Seneki because they remain very attached to the Catholic religion, and we wanted to show this in our exhibition. Another piece from our collection has the same kind of Latin inscription. This allows us to identify the origin of this necklace. This was a gift to the Immaculate Virgin. You can see this at the top of the screen. This is our partner, Wendat's partner, Jonathan, who's examining it. For some people, some members of the communities, this shows the sustainable and the long-term nature of the relationship that they have with the Immaculate Virgin. I know that churches are being highly criticized in North America and in Canada at the moment. And for some partners, they were saying that they are able to identify the power within these objects despite it all. Michael Galban, who is director of the Seneca Cultural Center, said the following, said this whilst he was talking at this event. This necklace is very interesting because for Indigenous peoples, it uses the most sacred and most holy materials. This is an emotional necklace. It was probably blessed by the Jesuits and has become a holy piece for both people. It has become somehow doubly holy. So you can see how objects that may appear to be symbols of colonization can be conceived in very different ways with the partners, even with those that are not directly culturally connected with these pieces. The objects studied under the quai project, as I said, can rarely be attributed to a specific nation. They constitute a representative collection of North America. So here we can see stylistic affinities and symbolic affinities that create a sort of shared belonging between neighboring Indigenous peoples. They do not necessarily want object restitution, but they want to be able to take ownership in some sort of this piece. So Jamie Jacobs, who is director of one of the centers that we are working with, that is also an artist and ritualista from the Seneca Nation. He produces traditional products inspired by ancient methods using this atypical stitching methods, producing objects based on pieces that he has inherited from his ancestors. He is at the spearhead of the Seneca language and is very attached to the idea of passing down this knowledge, especially from women who used to hold on to this knowledge. Jamie Jacobs has received a number of awards for the native Indian markets. To finish off, I would like to mention a number of discussions on social media from our meeting in October 2021 and March 2022. So here you can see a message from Jamie Jacobs exclaiming how beautiful the pieces were. A number of people replied to this. Someone said, "These are beautiful objects, but when are you going to bring them home?" Jamie Jacobs asked that he did not ask for any gifts in return, but perhaps just some more beautiful pieces. So I'm going to leave you to read one of his posts. This final message gives significant reflection for our debate at the moment, knowing that this pure and simple restitution of some objects, transferring them from one cultural institution to another is not very important, is not going to be very useful. Some need to be returned to communities, but for others, the point will be restituting the ancestral techniques and know-how. What Jamie Jacobs talks about here is not the restitution of the object itself, but something intangible that will lead to the re-injection of something into his community. This is another form of restitution, which is only possible if the objects are accessible. And it is this accessibility that we need to be focusing on. In conclusion, I would like to say that under the quai project, our number one objective was and is still to build long-term relationships that will allow us to continue dialogue on our collection and our colonial past. The question of restitution has not come up yet, but I'm sure that it will arise sooner or later. But that's not important. Prior to that, we need to have mutual understanding and discussion. Our Seneca partners were able to work with us, and they saw this as a means of reparation for violence past. It was a recognition of their sovereignty, and we did not expect for it to be received in this way. Our Wampum exhibition has been able to travel across other countries and nations in 6 different institutions in order to give all of the community the opportunity to visit. Signs have been adapted to the new audience each time, and a desire to announce from our partners and to highlight the renewal of relationships between French partners and these communities. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup pour cette riche présentation.
Thank you very much for this very rich presentation. Unfortunately, time is a bit pressed, so I'm going to, without further ado, hand over to Véronique Moulinier and Sylvie Sagne, who are going to give an anthropologist presentation of the question that we're talking about today. Good afternoon. Thank you for this invitation. To the question that's asked in the context of this roundtable, we're going to try to answer it through two examples, the Mézin Museum of Society, and second example, we can see that these museums do connect between the museum and the society that they're trying to show, which give a complex idea of belonging. The first example is going to be in Arles, at the Musée Arletan. Frédéric Mistral put together cultural heritage, and he used a museum to try to pass this on. He used the city of Arles to be the resting place of this collection. They are both the people to whom this collection is destined, the subject of the story, but also the actors and stakeholders, because they were called in to make donations to the collection throughout the 20th century and up until now. This museum and the people of Arles have maintained this three-way relationship. As we explain in Arles, the Arletan Museum is not a museum like any other. It is an extension of their own home, their family life, and the memory of their grandparents. The people of Arles don't forget what the museum is made up of, objects donated by their families, and they therefore consider the museum as an extension of their own homes. If the museum had ceased to be this extension of the home of the Arles people, who continue to feed into this museum, this museum is still a place now where the family souvenirs and memories are donated and given over. So the most surprising thing is that the people who have the most legitimacy in donating their items refuse to donate, particularly artists and craftspeople who could enrich the collections, woodworkers, pottery workers, and so on, who I met as part of my study and survey. I'd like to try to explore this paradox. These artists and craftsmen say that they owe a lot to this museum. Virginie, who has reinvented the piety boxes called beatifics, she said, "This museum is something special for me. When I go in there, I am filled both physically and spiritually by everything that is around me. I would like to live in the Arletan Museum." Olivier, who is a woodworker, says that this museum is part of my profession. It's essential. So there's a deep connection with it. Together, we come to the Arletan Museum like a form of consultation of the area in which we work. So we don't hesitate to use the museum as an display place for our workshop or our work. I was told that when people come to the museum, we don't have all of these Provençal furniture items on sale, so I send customers to the museum. This reflects the authenticity of the proposal of this museum. It is more than a guide. It inspires production, and it confirms a certain form of liberty. So a local craftsperson who made a nativity figure which was inspired by the model from the museum, and instead of having a basket on the head of the figure, the bakery, she put the basket on the arm of the baker woman. She said, "I did it in my own way," she said. And she said, "I saw there was a similar thing in the museum, and it had been done before me." So the things that are seen in the museum can, in addition to a broader view, can anchor the activity within Provençal culture, and it gives a sense of ongoing reading, how one can see new things, even if you've been for a visit 20 times to the museum. One day I saw something new on the second floor of the house. I was delighted to see it. I hadn't wasted my time in the day, and I discovered something new. The Arleton Museum is an inexhaustible source. It could be compared to a text written in a special type of ink that only reveals itself as the visitor desires to see it. The museum reveals itself a bit in the same way that a creator discovers him or herself, a bit like Pygmalion. So there is a form of devolution of the museum. Some artists have given their objects to the museum, but very few. The things that are given over to the museum are different. Archive records, people will give a hand to the museum to run workshops with children, and the artist would tend to give their own objects to other museums. People say very clearly and unanimously it's very difficult to donate to the Arleton Museum. People say that it's that their pieces of art are too contemporary, too ordinary. People think that it's a bit too banal. They're saying that they don't want to give something to the museum. If you donate their work to the museum, it should be something exceptional. At the same time, in the same unanimous voice, the artists gave arguments that could argue against this. The objects in the museum are ordinary items, not necessarily exceptional items. So if this wasn't the case, then you wouldn't see wardrobes, bookshelves, or pieces of furniture in the museum displaying the most significant, meaningful items of production or creation from the local area. This type of museum sometimes extended to develop into books or websites. So making a workshop or a shop look like a museum is not exclusive with working with the Arleton Museum. This gives another perception of the museum, the idea of a museum that is not changing enough. The archives are full and you always see the same things. I would like the display cases to change a bit, I was told. Or sometimes I've been told, I've never really understood. There are some things that are, not that they're going rotten, but some things that have been there for a long time. It's starting to be seen as a mausoleum or an old-fashioned museum, not the kind of place for those who would really like to see their works enter into the permanent collection. This person said that I wouldn't give my work to be drowned in the mass of everything that's there. Could we imagine a museum that could highlight all of these ideas and passions. So the idea of the museum might be a prevention to the potential creators. On the other hand, a museum of society like the Arletan Museum might be able to present some singularities. I'm going to hand over now to Véronique, who's going to give the example of the Mézin Museum. Thank you, Sylvie. Thank you for this invitation to speak to you today. The second example that we're going to give, we're going to leave the southeast of France and we're going to go to the southwest, and we're going to stop in a place called Mézin in a area of just 1,500 people in the southwest of the Lot-et-Garonne department. It was a village that knew prosperity and fame because of cork production. In the 1930s, it was thought that Mézin was the world capital of corks. In the 1960s, difficulties started to appear due to the competition from plastic wine corks, and another difficulty, which was the loss of the cork oak forests because of decolonizations, because these trees were mainly found in Algeria. The cork works closed one after the other. In 1980, cork production in Mézin had more or less finished, and that's the time that a small group of people, including cork makers and a few people from the local learned society, this little group of volunteers and enthusiasts decided to come together to create a museum. They decided to exhibit the local treasures, the treasures of their little village. 3 types of treasures were included, 3 very different types of treasures that they wanted to promote. The 3 sets which were outside of the normal museum categories. The first set of items was an archaeological set of items. The group decided to show the results of an archaeological dig in the Calais site in the Mézin area, where in 1972 there was a Jupiter that was found, a very beautiful item that was that is exhibited in one of the rooms. The second room is Armand Fayot room, from 1800 to 1932. He was a president of the W between 1906 and 1913. He was born in Mézin and he owned property in the village. There is a plaque in his honor on the church wall of the church. So this is the major personality who connects local history with national history. And the third set is industrial heritage. And here they highlighted the cork making work. The cork makers renovated their machines, found the objects that they used for their work. They might have been bookkeeping records, there might have been tools, and all of this was in a room of this museum. All of this was installed in a municipal building, and volunteers, cork makers and local historians were the curators and guides in the museums. They opened the doors, they gave the guided tours. So it was a local museum, the museum of the local people, the museum where people were at home. Let me give you one example. This is an issue around the key to the door of the museum. I was told this story. There were several copies of the key. The person whose turn it was to open up one day wasn't there, particularly on a Sunday. If people had friends round for dinner or for coffee, they might want to show the museum, but you might not have the key, so you would go to see a certain neighbor and say, I know who's got the key, let's go and find it, and let's go and visit the museum together. This story of the key was really important. It shows that people always knew where the key was, and at any time it was possible to go and visit the museum. So this museum was very well supported by local people, and it operated for 10 years or so. And then in 1990s, the Culture and Heritage Department of the local council tried to take over the museum and manage it. It carried out modernization and restructuring work, and they tried to bring some order and scientific rigor to this fairly amateurish museum. They wanted to move on from volunteering to a professional work of the museum. So they hoped that they would get accreditation as a Museum of France. We can see that in the 1990s, there was a form of consecration of this museum, which had been founded by a group of local enthusiasts who'd done what they'd been able to do to take their museum as far as they could, but it wasn't necessarily compliant with all the standards. Is it a form of consecration? Before I can answer that question, let's think about what this restructuring and modernization consisted of. It led to the museum that was more specialized and focused on one particular industry. So they got rid of all of the archaeological items. The Jupiter from Mézin is now shown in the Aquitaine Museum in a completely different place. So then what were you going to do with the second set of collections with this famous man of Mézin? He was chucked out on the streets, if you like. He had a small little room just as an annex site, but the heart of this new museum is the cork making past of the village. The name of the museum was changed. The first name of the museum was simply called the Mézin Museum, and the second time it was called the Cork Museum. In general, the objects that are presented are still the objects from the first version, but displayed and exhibited in a new way. The focus is on the cork making past. So 2/3 of what was initially presented is no longer there, and the discourse has changed. It's no longer about Mézin as a place, but it's about cork making in Mézin and more broadly. In addition to that, the cork makers who were guides were replaced by audio guides and cardboard cutouts representing cork makers. So this new version of the museum, which had previously been seen as the accomplishment of a consecration by the cork makers, was then perceived as a takeover by the departmental authorities. I was both a witness and a victim of this, and I will explain the circumstances of this. In 1996, when the new museum project was already underway, I was asked by the Culture and Heritage Department to carry out a study into the cork making techniques that we use. The project was well underway. I was presented, my mission was presented during a drinks reception that was held in Mézin in the central square of the village, close to the museum square where people would get together and play boules together. I was introduced by the new creator who explained that I was going to carry out a study and survey, and please would people welcome me and so on. I wasn't able to introduce myself. I didn't even have the time to pick up what was going on locally, and I was given a post. I was the ethnologist from the departmental council. I realized very quickly that I couldn't carry out this study. The doors were closed. People didn't want to speak to me. I was asking people, you can need to explain how corks were made, and people said, just go to the museum, and it's very well explained. But the museum doors were closed, and people just didn't want to speak to me. So I couldn't carry out this survey. Instead, I played the role as the fuse that had to be a circuit breaker to preserve both sides in the electric circuit. The local people felt like their museum had been taken away from them, but they couldn't do anything about it. All they could do was to refuse to talk to the ethnologist who was working on behalf of the departmental council. There was a similar feeling that I heard elsewhere. They've taken us our museum. It's their problem. It's no longer our issue. It's no longer our museum. It's theirs. It's their problem. So once again, the cultural explainers and mediators who work in the museums are still struggling to work properly. It's a real issue because the local community, even 20 years afterwards, is still turning the back on this museum, which is no longer their museum, but it is the departmental council's museum. So to conclude, you can see that in both cases, both in Arles and in Mézin, museum can be a bit like a black hole. In Arles, you can see that the museum give things back, but in Mézin we see that the museum can be taken open. We're not asking that for any return or restitution of these objects. The local community in Mézin has turned their back on the museum. The real question is about the legitimacy of the ownership, not the legal legitimacy, that's settled, but the moral legitimacy. Initially, everything goes well as long as the community, a collection of people, works together. If it's for the local people, for themselves, that works well. The problem is when cultural institutions come into place because they cut off the organic link initially of these collections made by the people, for the people, with the people.
Merci beaucoup, Sylvie et Véronique.
Thank you very much, Sylvie and Veronique, for these two presentations and this question that you raised about the legitimacy, the cultural legitimacy, which it sort of sidesteps this question of the legal ownership and legal legitimacy. Thank you for these two examples which illustrate this. I've been told that we have overrun the times for our sessions. I think we're going to move on to the second round table right now. If Manlio, Veronique, Sylvie were able, Alice, you were able to come online, we'll have a longer question-answer session after this next session and have a Q&A for the two sessions at that stage. While we wait for everyone to come to the stage, could I ask if Chedlia is with us on Zoom? Could you turn on your camera, please? We can see you. Could you say something so we can check if we can hear you? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
On fait une table ronde sans table. Il manque une chaise, une place. Moi, je vais me mettre par là. Et comme ça, je vais pas rester.
Tu peux rester debout quand même.
Ah oui. Ça fait des filles d'un côté, les garçons de l'autre.
Ah oui, mais restez là, je vais me mettre en bout.
Attends, on va décaler comme ça. Décaler comme ça. Ah oui. Il manque une chaise.
Cette chaise.
Oui, on est allé en chercher.
Au milieu, tu peux.
Je me mets là.
Alors on fait les chaises musicales, celui qui parle s'assoit et les autres écoutent.
Est-ce que vous m'entendez? Il nous manque une chaise et on n'a pas arrondi la.
Can you hear me? We're short of one chair. We're going to move into our third session of this professional conference. My name is Lies Smith. I'm an advisor on the history of collections at the Museum of Quai Jacques Chirac. We're following on from the previous session, going on from the issue of belonging to, and we are going to be thinking about our responsibility in terms of accessibility and presentation of collections to the public. Ownership as an exclusive system is moving on to talk about a sense of collective belonging, to quote Vincent. We heard from the Director of Culture of UNESCO. She said that cultural items belong to humanity and we need to pass it on to future generations in view to education and reflection and knowledge sharing. So there is no legal obligation to restitute the cultural items. There is a moral responsibility to dialogue and build a lasting cultural partnership. So dialogue is at the heart of our professional practices. And we are going to be developing professional practices with respect to the history of collections alongside the countries of origin. Ethics are the heart of what we do. The rich collaboration with the countries and communities of origin are vital. We need to work with museum professionals, heritage professionals, researchers, and people who hold intangible knowledge. These collaborations are very rich in all areas: history, material, museography, and the way in which these can be presented to the public. So we're going to try through the experience of our speakers to give you a few answers about the keys to this type of dialogue. How can we co-design a research project in collaboration? Who are the key people? How can these interventions be mapped? What funding is available? How can we build relationships of trust? What semantics and language should this dialogue use? How can we draw on the ideas of heritage and things that make sense to other cultures in order to interpret them and present them? How can dialogue enable a new dialogue with former colonized countries? In order to debate these questions, I am delighted to welcome a number of experts, dear colleagues. First of all, I'm going to introduce Chedlia Annabi. I hope that you can hear us. She's a member of ICOM Tunisie, one of the two permanent members of ICOM, and she's working on the ICOM Code of Ethics. Chedlia, over to you. I hope that you can hear us. Then we also have with us Charles Persona, who is director of the National Institute of Heritage, which trains conservators and restoration professionals. Emmanuel Kasarhérou, president of the Quai Jacques Chirac Museum since 2021. Gaëlle Beaujean, head of the Africa collection at the Quai Museum, Felicity Bodenstein, who is a lecturer at Sorbonne University, guest researcher at the Branly Museum, and we are delighted to welcome you for a residency here since September, and Jean-François Chougnet is president of the Musée in Marseille, the Museum of Civilizations of Europe and the Mediterranean. Felicity, I'm going to start with you. You're an art historian and a specialist in the history of museums and collections. Since 2019, you've been working as a lecturer at Sorbonne University. You co-lead the Digital Benin project. How have you been able to put together the research, collaborative research project as part of Digital Benin?
I have a PowerPoint presentation, if we can get that ready. Thank you. So yes, my talk today will be focusing on a concrete proposal that is underway in order to modestly contribute. It's to the significant loss of knowledge along with this paradigmatic object collection which has disappeared. We refer to these as the Benin bronzes or the treasures of Benin City, the matter of their restitution to the African continent. One of my colleagues in particular has mentioned the project, the planned restitution of these objects from a German museum. I'm going to be talking about this project, and it has been ongoing in Germany as well since 2020, with the aim of bringing back together the treasures from Benin City that were dispersed after a British military campaign from 1897. There were a number of consequences which led to the dispersal and extraction through the markets of at least 5,000 objects, but we imagine that this will need to be revised. Some estimates believe that there are up to 10,000 objects. I believe that the truth is probably somewhere between that. So the mark in Hamburg and is financed by the Siemens. We have collaborated with researchers across Europe, Nigeria, and the US and France, including myself. There are also a number of art historians and specialists in digital technologies and digital art. We have connected around 6,000 objects provided by around 100 institutions in order to bring together, to connect together this digital collection within a living expression of Benin City. So I'd like to present this project as an opportunity of digital technologies in order to rethink our possibility for telling stories around objects. What are the opportunities of digital technologies in order to counteract this effect of extraction that we've talked about a lot, this appropriation through globalization? This is an older criticism of museums that dates back to the French Revolution, and this remains relevant when we look at a collection like this today, which was obtained through a form of extreme violence and is now there is now a very large geographic distance between the place of origin and the place of exhibition, and this is a very difficult distance to breach. We had quite a simple idea when designing this project. We wanted to bring together data from the different museums about objects that came from Benin City. The idea was born of an idea from colleagues in Benin City. There are two museum directors, Jonathan Fine and Caroline Frankensteiner, and myself, and then an expert in digital humanities. We worked with another professor from Benin City. We had a lot of relationships and contacts and colleagues in Benin City. The colleagues really were asking for this very pragmatic and practical tech tool in order to open up these collections. This was a more abstract issue for people working in digital heritage, where it requires multiple data sources, and historians were asking how we can build links between databases so that we can conduct research using different databases. There are a number of technical issues associated with that, and I won't be talking about them today, but we were focusing on access and technology from the start. There was then an initial workshop with different actors from Nigeria and across the world. We wanted to propose a tool with a priority target audience. We did not just want to bring all of the data together just like that. We wanted to target a particular audience that would identify with this very strongly. Sometimes this audience would struggle to access internet, so we needed to ensure that it could be accessible by smartphones, as this audience primarily, this public primarily use smartphones, and the internet bandwidth is not always brilliant. This was a structural element, but we needed to think about how we could present these items given the 120 years of unilateral understanding of a culture. There was a lot of absence and lacks in the information that we had. The vernacular language very rarely used the terms used to describe these objects, even though they were the ones who built them. And even in digital reproductions, we can find derogatory terms or even racist terms to refer to these objects. So it's not just about bringing together these objects in an encyclopedic manner. We were also aware that we did not want to have a decontextualization or appropriation approach continued. So we did not want to perpetuate the issues of the authors of this violence. And these interests were centered on the objects as a tangible object, but it was not especially developed historically speaking, and not with links to Benin City today. So we started with without knowing really how we were going to solve these problems. But we did build a relatively strong and small team in Nigeria. Their work was to create a directory of objects in Benin City, but also to find a strategy in order to strike a balance within this mountain of data coming from Europe and America. This structure meant that there was a lot on the shoulders of this team in Nigeria, with Goldtree Ekado and Egosa Obobaifo, two researchers in Nigeria, and Professor Konkunre Egafona, who helped coordinate that team. It was difficult to expect them to manage to rebalance 125 years of pillaging of objects from Benin City. I think the issue of the burden of representation is something that we also need to think about. I'd like to call upon an older representation now from 1990 in a text called Black Art and the Burden of Representation, saying that the Western world, in the oldest sense of the world, is opening the way to artists of color, but we were expecting them to prove, in some sense, their authenticity. Within collaborative research, the problem is different, but I do believe that this risk of the burden of representation here is sometimes present, especially in the quest of a more authentic and real information, which could contain these pitfalls. So, bearing all of that in mind, with our team, we wanted to build something where different perspectives would be connected without erasing one another. And this is where digital technologies are an amazing tool. You have the infinite possibilities to create links and to create different ways so that visitors can go from one world to another without having without making one world superimpose over another. They're able to coexist together. So I would just like to say a few words about the construction of this site. It cannot yet be visited. It will be released in November. It's currently under construction. So let me show you the homepage as it is at the moment. This will probably change, but it's just to mention an aspect which was very important initially for our colleagues in Nigeria. When you go on the digital Benin website, they wanted two things. They wanted that the first reflection was not the first reflection was about the rich culture in Benin City with a number of similar objects. They did not want the discourse, and this didn't necessarily come as a surprise to us, but the project started with the matter of the objects taken in in the 1897. They didn't want that to be at the very center of everything that we were doing on this website. So we tried to develop 8 different entry points. So there are 3 where the information proposed is based on museum data, so the catalogue, institutions, and the provenance, and 3 others which are based on research carried out by colleagues in Nigeria. So 2 with Eyo Oto and Itan Edo, which means foundation. I'm not able to, I don't have a pointer with me. Edo means foundation. And this is the story of Benin. It tells the story of the Benin Kingdom. And the third is a collection of oral history. And all of the signs and drawings on the website were designed by an artist from Benin City called Osase Emadasun, and I thank him for his work. It really supports the visuals on the website. So let me tell you about the map now. I believe that this is a way that gives us a good visual idea of the imbalance that we're trying to work on. We can go from one map to another by zooming in. You can switch from the map of Benin City to the map of institutions, which gives you this effect of switching from one to the other. So on the map of Benin City, my colleagues have worked very hard to help visitors to understand the cultural meaning and importance of all of the different objects. This is difficult to establish with certainty, but they have been able to make certain assumptions around this and then to have a cultural map of Benin City. The second map is a map of institutions which have these objects. And in Benin City, there is also a museum which is also included in the catalogue of our objects. We can also put these into pairs. It doesn't work completely, but this is what we were trying to do. So Eyo Oto is a learning space designed by Egosa, who wanted this to be based on what was discovered on the ground. The idea is that during research in Benin City to digitize the collections, there were Benin or AO used to identify objects. There are a lot of errors in terminology when referring to Benin City. She therefore wanted to correct some of those terms. This became a project to create a new nomenclature for artists and researchers, linguists, historians in Benin City in order to propose words to identify the different groups of objects and their functions. This may appear quite simple, but it's nice to be able to click on something, listen to the term, understand how it's pronounced in the Ide language. It's also very important because the categories used do not necessarily correspond to the categorization, which was relatively standard in European museums. So let me give you a very simple idea. Sorry, I'm running a bit behind. I will wrap up soon, but a very simple example is AMA. In Benin City, this refers to any kinds of 3D sculpture, which includes wood and bronze, whereas in the categorization in English, there's a relief plaque in bronze and in wood, and these are two different groups. So we can very easily go from one group to the other and see the different ways we have of categorizing the objects. I'm going to go very quickly now. There's also the catalog, which shows data provided by museums, and we can also search in this catalog. There are different languages. The museums had different description matrices and different categorizations. We tried to standardize that in order to create a search engine that would work across all of this. So you were able to select a name of provenance and a bronze plaque designation, and you will be able to find all of the bronze plaques related to a specific location. The idea was to strike a balance between oral history and the institutions and data provided by institutions. This history is primarily based on local sources that have been collected by Golfiator, with whom we worked very closely. I was responsible for post-colonization, and he was a kind of communicator and moderator between that space and the current Benin City. So we try to link them and create parallels without necessarily creating a ranking or classification system. There is a lot that we would do differently if we could start again, obviously. I hope that this will be an archive that will last over time, and I hope that we have the resources to pursue the different collaboration possibilities that we have announced. We will need significant funding to maintain this over time. I'm going to stop on that, as I think that we will probably talk about that in other presentations as well. Thank you very much, Felicity. Thank you for presenting this project and the pitfalls. We would be really interested to hear what you would have done differently as well. We will remember this notion of rebalancing the history of objects and the role of storytelling within that. That was very interesting. We're now going to hear another collaborative story. Gaëlle Beaujean, you are responsible for the African collections at the Musée du Quai Branly. Jacques Chirac, anthropologist and sociologist, and you coordinate a very ambitious project at the moment the mission of Djibouti, and you're going to show us how we can share sources within this project. And I think that this is a founding project in the history of the museum. In any case, we're at the start of this project. I cannot pretend that it's so significant, but thank you so much for this invitation. The question of our session is the challenge of dialogue. In order to dialogue, we need to find a common language. If the discussion is about the provenance of collections, language will focus on the constitution of these collections, the history, and all of the primary or periphery sources related to that. And then, of course, all of the subtleties of vocabulary that we will find in the sources. And this is something we will perhaps be able to discuss later. But in any case, the museum has been focusing during the past year on an emblematic work in order to form a baseline for our Africa collections in what is becoming the Musée de l'Homme, the Museum of Man. We're looking at the ethnographical and linguistic study of Djibouti between 1931 and 1933. There were 16 countries that were independent, stretching right down to Ethiopia. There was a multidisciplinary team documenting every day over 2 years everything that they saw, collected, photographed, filmed, and recorded. The secretary of the mission, Michel Herris, held a diary at the same time, which he published when returning. This is called Afrique Fantôme or Phantom Africa. The Gallimard publishers were able to publish this with notes by Jean Géma, with letters with Jean Géris. The language used is without filter, and it's a lot rawer than what was shown in the agenda, describes the theft and the acquisition of objects, the requisition of objects. There's also questions, and today we are starting with an investigation. Before starting dialogue with the countries from this mission, the Musée du quai Branly Jacques Chirac approached academics, particularly anthropologists and art historians who've been working on this mission in recent years, particularly Claire Bosquet-Tissé, Éric Joly, Marianne Lemaire, and Julien Bondaz. We identified the main sources and collections distributed across Paris and its region between the university library, laboratories, and museums. The majority of photos and objects are conserved here at the Musée du quai Branly Jacques Chirac. The manuscripts and documentation from Ethiopia is held elsewhere. The naturalist specimens are split physically between the Jardin des Plantes and the Museum of Natural History and the Museum of Man. The majority of archives produced by the mission are at the University of Nanterre in the library, with over 10,000 field sheets, notebooks, photographs, diaries that are conserved in that location. Almost everything has been digitized but is not available online. This is also true for archives held at the National Museum of Natural History, where information has been digitized but is not available online. Around 20 recordings, audio recordings are available online and conserved at the University of Paris-Nanterre in the psychology department. The availability of researchers, curators, and the access to resources in these institutions were necessary before our research with colleagues in the countries. This work has began in September 2021 with colleagues from Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Mali, Senegal, and Chad. The Ministry of Culture in France gave us a subsidy which allowed us to engage two directors. working in Mali and in Chad. We are also working with a curator from Burkina Faso who studied the 4 objects collected by this mission in Burkina Faso. Perhaps I should have specified the number of objects. There are 3,700 objects, 6,000 photographs, and around 5,000 naturalist specimens. So the method when our 3 colleagues came was to go through the journey day by day of the explorers on the mission to try to collect the names from the different collections, the African translators, for instance, and the people, the colonial staff as well, people. Sometimes they went through 4 different sites and collected about 100 objects within a single day, the type of investigations that they carried out. And we also consulted objects in our storerooms. This helped us to nuance the acquisitions and categorize them on the basis of all of these available sources, and to discover in parallel to this research into the objects, the extent of written and or photographic information on the technologies used, transcriptions, historical descriptions of landscape, ethnographic terms that come back regularly, like circumcision, architecture, children's games, traps, etc. So 80 years later, the heart of our reflection is about acquisition and whether or not it was legitimate. Sorry, I have got a little bit lost in my notes. So this collection of information, images and sound were also research topics for our African colleagues. They wanted to understand the colonial context better, depending on the cultures and specific regimes, such as indigenous peoples. We're talking about legitimacy here. This is not the same case as during war, for instance. Anonymous, technical, religious and environmental issues over the past 80 years. However, we've encountered a number of obstacles. The first is about how to share these sources. Investigations in ethnography require recruitment, so these 10,000 sheets cannot be consulted individually. Errors have been identified by members of the mission themselves. So, for example, there is a secret language, and archives need to be shared on a case-by-case basis, and representatives from the cultures alerted us to this as well. There are ethical issues managed by Monica Hens from the University of Nanterre, who's observing this. Her speciality is on ethical questions of this kind of work. So the Professor Einsen supports us step by step and has been observing us in our ethical conversations, which is at the heart of these joint discussions. I should add that we also work with a number of associations. One is represented by Emina Kaldai, who is present here. This is the Alternative Association with Young People for Montreuil. And other associations also involve the diaspora. I am going to wrap up very shortly. I'm not going to be able to go into greater detail, but research needs to now be more detailed into the regime of indigenous peoples, colonial contexts that underpinned this mission. We were talking about gifts earlier. There was this question. And who was around during collection? I talked about the number of different locations that were visited. The national collections and collections in the countries of origin need to be consulted. We need to have the origins more clearly identified. We have made lots of progress, but with everything that I've said, we do not necessarily have enough resources. We've worked with the National Agency for Research, working with this full collective that I've already mentioned. We've also applied for a European project for a consortium of European and African museums. This project was led by Monica Hens. So territories of counter-investigation in Paris, for instance, are very limited, but we've been working on that. I would like to thank the Alternative Association, once again, that's been working in Dakar with schools and young people from Montreuil in order to carry out investigations into one of the first projects found in Dakar. I have also been working with my colleagues from Benin on around 10 different sites for 10 days. All of this has been filmed. So this is a counter-investigation, particularly in the countries of origin, in order to constitute a source which we believe is important, even though it is very fragile, as it is 90 years after the event. But this is an oral source. It is perhaps more fragile, but it is also important in order to ensure balance within our analysis. This research focuses on collections and potential restitution applications, but it will be creating a multi-sector exhibition, which we are hoping will be able to tour Africa by the end of 2023. I hope that our database will be made available online. And we hope that we will have touched a number of different fields and worked on this matter of language as well by citing our new sources that we're starting to create with the African team. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Gaëlle. Donc, nous avons vu 2 projets qui concernent les pays africains. On va pas vraiment quitter l'Afrique, mais...
Thank you very much, Gaëlle. We've seen 2 questions about the African continent, and we're going to remain on the edge of the Mediterranean. Jean-François Chougnet, you are president of the Musée in Marseille on the project Algeria, France. Could you talk about the project that you've carried out with your Algerian counterparts? Thank you very much. If there is a country around the Mediterranean which needs this dialogue with all the complexity that entails, it is indeed Algeria. And I think it's important that we should talk about the difficulties inherent in this dialogue. The issues around memory and questions that are very subtle and complex. For our museum, the Museum of European and Mediterranean Civilization, it seemed an obvious thing, but as soon as something seems obvious, that's when the difficulties start. So we know that the museum took a long time in the planning, and the subject of Algeria was put on the table with exhibition that was planned to be entitled Through the Words from Algiers, and there was a very strong conflict with the municipality, which didn't agree with the way the exhibition was going to be presented and the wording of it. So the museum wanted to make space for Algeria. And as you undoubtedly know, we feel that Marseille is a city that has very strong links with Algeria. About 60% of the city has connections with Algeria in the past or the present. There are the Pieds Noirs populations who came across at the time of independence. There are people from the Harki communities who fought alongside the French. There are people who were political exiles from the dark era of the Algerian troubles in the 1990s. There were children of these immigrants. So around 60% of people in Marseille have connections of some sort with Algeria. we are a city of 850,000 people. 140,000 of those are registered with the Algerian consulate in Algeria. Even in the official figures, the numbers are very, very high. So there is a real question. And the first major project that we were able to carry out, which was an idea from Zahir Ramani and John Izara. It was an exhibition which was called Made in Algeria, and the subtitle was Genealogy of a Territory. And the idea was something that we've always defended right till now, is that the minor role that a museum of society like the Museum can play is to tell the story over the long term. We could avoid cutting up the history of Algeria into the different periods of the different different historical periods. With Algerian officials, we might talk about the times after 1962, the War of Independence, or 1965, the Boumediene era, the Pied Noir population who had to flee at that time. We'll talk about a kind of golden era before that. We need to look at the history over a long period of time. This is something inspired by the work of Braudel. Braudel, as you know, worked in his first job on the history of Algeria. We need to go back to the history before 1830, this period of colonial history that isn't often talked about. In 1830, as you may know, when 1930 was the centenary of the colonial takeover was celebrated. It was known as the centenary of Algeria. This was an understanding at the time, which historians now refute, which was to say that there was no Algerian history worthy of the name before the colonial takeover in 1830. So what we wanted to do was present Roman Algeria and the other populations that had been in Algeria. So the idea of the genealogy of a territory exhibition was to unfold that's a map, if you like. There was a lot of mapping in this exhibition to show the way that the territory had been shaped and structured during different historical eras, and in particular through the colonial history. And then an event happened which led us to need to improvise and work differently. That was the decision taken by the new mayor of the Montpellier agglomeration to abandon the project which was underway. And the title of this was going to be called the Museum of the History of France in Algeria. No comment, I would say, about this. And a new leader, Florence Houellebecq, it was renamed as the Museum of the History of France and Algeria. This plan of the museum was abandoned in 2014 when the control of the city of Montpellier changed hands. And this embryonic collection of around 1,000 objects was a very partial process with many gaps in the collection, and the state collections which had been planned to create this museum it didn't exist. The museum didn't itself accept. The museum has a speciality in collecting up the collections from museums that close. There are museums of societies that close from time to time, and so we have a lot of work, and we have done over the last few decades. But it wasn't a case for us to rebuild either George Fresh, the previous politician's project, or even the project that came after us from Montpellier. But we did find that we had some interesting documents and items. And we felt that it was important to show these to the public. So we invented, alongside Camille Faucourt, who is here, and her successor in the project, we started a system where we were blending guided tours with debates and also often music, because music is also part of the common history. It's one of the few areas in which the different stakeholders of history can work together. We can listen to the same type of music with a different form of nostalgia for each of the community. It's perhaps sometimes easier than talking about issues of history and society. We held one cycle per year over 5 years, and in the simplest expression of dialogue, we're holding guided tours, display objects in display cases, some debates and some music events with people who would like to debate. So we've tried to create a platform in which we're obviously people aren't going to agree. There have been some very lively debates, some objections and arguments, but we felt that on our scale we might find that through the objects, that's where we talk about the voice of the objects, a common ground on which some level of dialogue could take place between these different stakeholders, these different communities. So we've organized in other circumstances the debate around the Made in Algeria exhibition. We had a big debate. Our room was a bit small for that, so we moved next door to the Villa Méditerranée building, which has more recently been transformed into the Cosca Cave exhibition. But in this big room, we felt that everyone was together in one place, and there was a form of dialogue. People talked together, no one convinced the other. I'm sure you'll believe me, but it was a very start of a debate. So just to finish the story, if you like, in 2022, it was there was a real question, because it was the 60-year anniversary of the Evian Accords. We couldn't, as the Museum, avoid this important historical question, important for all of the people I've mentioned, whatever their point of view on the Evian Accords. So I like going off the beaten track, and I said, let's not talk about the Evian Accords. It would have been too provocative. It would have been a bit pointless. But let's explore the different facets of the Emir Al-Qadir, who had the key feature of being claimed as a key figure for good or bad reasons by different stakeholders, different communities. And the curator comment of the exhibition, Camille Florence, who worked with Père Delorme and Algerian historian Amir Bouyaden, there was one of the last items in the exhibition was a juxtaposition. Visitors didn't always notice it, but there was a juxtaposition of two very short documents, one from the French television programs and one from the Algerian programs. One showed the post-war ceremony in which the post-colonial power claimed the heritage of Emir Al-Qadir, and the other document was the repatriation of the remains of the Emir, who, as you know, died in Damascus. The repatriation of his remains by the President Boumediene, a very cold ceremony with no warmth at all. So this highlighted the different perspectives of the Emir Al-Qadir, and we tried to highlight this juxtaposition. And the exhibition was a big surprise, because we had more than 120,000 visitors, which was an exhibition about a name, a figure which was familiar perhaps to some people, but wasn't that famous as he was in the 19th century, when Emir Al-Qadir was probably as well known as Madonna or Rihanna, we could just say, the Queen of England. I don't know. He was invited throughout the world. He was a nice invited to the inauguration of the Suez Canal, for example. We tried to find a certain historical weight, if you like, and I think that's the role of museums. It's our duty to try to establish the basis for a very difficult and tricky dialogue. Thank you very much. I am very sorry for hurrying my speakers. The subject matter is very interesting and exciting, but I'd ask you to note down your questions so we can have a little bit of discussion at the end of the session. I'm going to hand over to Chedlia, who is with us online. Can you hear me? We can hear you. Please speak very clearly. Yes, we can even see you on the screen, Chedlia. Thank you very much. Chedlia, in the midst of all of these reflections, because you are working to update the Code of Ethics in ICOM, could you tell us how you're working on this? I'm very sorry that it's very difficult to translate, Chedlia, because the sound is very unclear. Can people in the room understand what Chedlia is saying? Can you hear me?
On vous entend pas distinctement.
I'm afraid we're not hearing you very clearly.
Non. Vous m'entendez toujours pas?
Si, c'est beau. C'est un peu mieux.
Yeah, it's a tiny bit better. Don't touch the microphone and try to speak very clearly. Well, my talk is going to take an ethical approach, and I'm going to very briefly talk about the historical and sociological aspects of the questions. I'm terribly sorry as an interpreter. I'm afraid I can't interpret it. The quality of the sound is too difficult to be able to understand what the speaker is saying. I'm very sorry.
Je ne peux oublier mon origine, mon pays, et qui a été sous protectorat, et que j'appartiens également aux deux régions, africaines et arabes, régions au cœur de ce débat, puisque un bon nombre de leurs collections sont concernées, d'autant plus que j'ai beaucoup travaillé avec ces deux régions. Certains principes se rapportant à la notion de propriété sont suggérés dans l'actuel.
The interpreter apologizes. It's not going to be possible to translate this presentation because of the quality of the speaker's sound.
D'être revu et d'être enrichi, surtout à la lueur de tout ce que j'ai entendu ce matin. Dans l'actuelle étape des discussions pour la révision du code de déontologie des musées, les notions de propriété et d'appartenance ne sont pas apparues d'une manière explicite dans les propositions des membres de l'ICOM lors des consultations. Comme vous le savez, nous avons effectué 2 consultations depuis le mois de janvier. Nous avons également organisé plusieurs webinaires dans différentes régions représentées essentiellement par les membres dans l'ICOM. Et nous nous rendons compte que cette notion de propriété est suggérée dans l'actuel code de déontologie où on parle, comme je l'ai dit, de gestionnaire. Par contre, on peut considérer qu'elles sont implicitement évoquées à travers les notions de décolonisation et de restitution qui ont été par contre très largement proposées comme thème majeur à inclure dans la nouvelle version du code de
The interpreter apologizes. It's not possible to translate this speaker because of the quality of the sound feed that we are receiving.
Quelles sont les motivations de cette tendance apparue depuis quelques temps dans de nombreux pays et musées détenteurs de collections originaires de pays tiers Est-ce uniquement une volonté de débattre de cette nouvelle approche? Est-ce un souci purement déontologique et de respect des principes des droits universels humains? Est-ce une réaction à un activisme assez poussé dans certains pays d'où proviennent ces collections? Un dialogue donc doit s'instaurer pour essayer de trouver des réponses à toutes ces interrogations. Tout d'abord, un dialogue entre les détenteurs actuels de ces collections qui va déterminer les enjeux et les défis potentiels, de même que les incidents sur leur...
The English interpreter apologizes. It is not going to be possible to translate this speech because of the quality of the sound feed that we're receiving. Many apologies.
À comprendre leurs attentes, leur vision des notions de propriété et d'appartenance. Il contribuera aussi à évaluer les conséquences et les effets sur la gestion à court, à moyen et surtout à long terme sur leur musée et sur leur collection. Ma deuxième question est le pourquoi. Quelle est la finalité de cette interrogation? À qui appartiennent les collections? Est-ce un but en soi? Ou bien est-ce le début d'un processus possible, voire espéré des pays dont ces collections sont originaires? L'objectif est-il une remise en question de l'interprétation, l'exposition, la conservation et la présentation des collections? Ou bien, au-delà de cette interrogation, prévoit-on d'autres actions communes et consensuelles? Toutes ces interrogations ne peuvent être résolues que par un dialogue pluriel, profond, impliquant toutes les parties concernées. Dans l'actuel code de déontologie, le principe 6 est consacré aux collections qui proviennent d'un pays tiers.
The interpreters apologize that the sound is not of good enough quality to translate this speech. Many apologies.
Locale, éthique, religieuse ou politique. Fin de citation. Il faut là aussi revoir la perception de cette notion de normalité selon les deux parties engagées dans ce dialogue. Dans l'actuel code, les points 3, 6, 6.5 et 6.7 reviennent sur des notions telles que la coopération, les partenariats, l'accord mutuel, le respect de la dignité humaine, des traditions et des cultures des pays d'origine. Toutes ces notions nous ramènent nécessairement à reconsidérer l'importance du rapport entre l'appartenance originelle des collections et leur propriété actuelle. Je voudrais juste donner un exemple qui m'a été donné lors d'une discussion avec un ami africain de l'Afrique de l'Ouest. Il m'a rapporté qu'une statuette arrachée à son contexte d'origine, à savoir une tombe, et qui est exposée dans un musée quelque part à travers le monde, est une souffrance continue pour l'ensemble de la communauté d'origine, car selon les croyances locales, le défunt ne connaîtra jamais la paix tant que cette statuette ne sera pas redéposée sur sa tombe. Voilà ce que le déplacement d'objets peut parfois engendrer comme frustration, comme sentiment d'incapacité, d'injustice, de perte d'identité et d'acculturation. Dans ce cas précis, l'appartenance semble évidente, la question ne se pose plus de réfléchir à une autre alternative. D'un point de vue déontologique, les musées ont toujours été conscients des liens indissociables qu'un objet peut avoir avec ses racines. Cela se voit dans les principes 3.7 et 6, mais cette prise de conscience a rarement été suivie d'une reconnaissance officielle et légale. Déontologiquement, les musées, selon le code actuel, respectent leur rôle de l'interprétation juste et fidèle de l'histoire des peuples. Dans les points 4 et 2, ils œuvrent à une authenticité des collections exposées en procédant à des actes d'écoute et de réconciliation avec les communautés dont elles sont issues. Cela se revoit dans les principes 2, 4 et particulièrement le principe 6. Mais ces principes éthiques sont-ils suffisamment mis en œuvre? L'appartenance et l'appropriation des collections n'est pas explicite, même si on reconnaît le droit aux populations de disposer et d'exprimer leur avis sur ces collections. Une autre notion qui découle implicitement de l'appartenance, mais également absente du code de déontologie actuel, c'est celle de la décolonisation. Elle est pourtant apparue comme proposition majeure dans toutes les consultations et discussions, et également dans des discussions en cours qui ont été menées par l'ETHCOM, mais aussi dans plusieurs études académiques. L'ETHCOM, ayant constaté son importance, se propose de l'intégrer dans la révision du code en faisant un nouveau principe, avec toutes ses spécificités. La décision d'employer le terme décolonisation reste encore sujet à débat et actuellement, rien n'a été décidé de son emploi ou non. Certes, ce concept de décolonisation ne fait pas l'unanimité. Personnellement, je le défends particulièrement, non pas uniquement du fait qu'il est apparu explicitement dans les consultations que nous avons reçues par les membres de l'ICOM, mais parce qu'il exprime parfaitement le désir des pays anciennement colonisés. Il est surtout empreint d'une charge symbolique de la mémoire qu'il entérine, à savoir la reconnaissance de la fin d'une politique, d'une vision au sein des musées. La décolonisation peut être envisagée d'abord par une révision du discours. Je pense que cela déjà a été abordé. Le discours des musées, détenteurs de collections provenant de pays anciennement colonisés et des visions profondes qu'ils génèrent. Il se trouve souvent lié à la notion de sacré, de croyance, de respect d'un patrimoine ancestral, de dignité humaine, du devoir envers une communauté. Toutes ces notions sont présentes dans l'actuel code, mais il est nécessaire de les revoir, de les renforcer par un texte plus explicite qui, nous l'espérons, sera adopté par la majorité. Le concept de décolonisation et la notion de restitution qui peut en découler nous mettent aujourd'hui face à de nombreux défis. Tout d'abord, la pluralité des intervenants, les divergences de points de vue, les motivations diverses. C'est pourquoi des critères devront être identifiés afin d'entamer ce dialogue d'une manière consensuelle, réduire les divergences entre, d'une part, les droits et les intérêts des peuples autochtones à disposer de leur patrimoine, et d'autre part, les activités universitaires et de recherche, l'attachement même de ceux qui détiennent actuellement ces collections. Nous devons tous faire face à cet exercice difficile d'une nouvelle réinterprétation des collections, initier un dialogue avec les parties concernées, avoir une écoute patiente et sans a priori, réfléchir ensemble aux retombées sociales, culturelles, patrimoniales, économiques et même politiques de cette nouvelle approche que les musées se proposent d'adopter. Je conclurai en disant que la révision du code de déontologie des musées est dans sa phase première. La réflexion d'aujourd'hui représente pour notre comité une importance capitale qui va nous aider à enrichir nos débats dans nos groupes de réflexion. D'où l'importance et la nécessité de considérer avec beaucoup d'attention toutes les propositions faites explicitement, mais également implicitement par les membres de l'ICOM et engager un dialogue élargi, rassembleur, sur le plan scientifique, mais également d'un point de vue déontologique. Merci pour votre écoute.
Merci beaucoup, Chedlia Annabi.
Thank you very much, Chedlia Annabi. I'm going to hand over now to Charles Persona. I know that you've been taking notes, so I don't know if you'll be able to respond on the fly to what Chedlia has said. You'll also be talking about the training programs and the international partnerships. We'd like to hear what you have to say about responsibility in passing on knowledge. I'm going to read out my notes, my very lengthy notes. No, I'm not going to do that. The question that I was wondering about when I was listening to previous speakers was the question of when we talk about ownership, are we owners? And my question is, are we good owners, good collection owners? Are we people who are taking into account the fact that ownership is only legitimate if it is subordinated to the common good? That's the thing that should guide us. And that's what we should, I think, try to pass on in the context of the training programs that we put in place within the National Heritage Institute. Firstly, we need to explain to French heritage professionals, curators, conservators, and restoration professionals they need to work on their corrections and pass them on to the next generations, but also to talk about them to national or international audiences. These audiences, because of a number of moral duties and legal obligations in our countries, we need to protect heritage in the common good. So that's my first thought. And I think it's a key point. It's important because we can see with the students that work with us, conservation and restoration professionals, each of them has a speciality, and it's very easy for them to get closed into their specialism and have a sense of ownership of the objects that belong to their speciality. So I think it's important in the initial training of heritage professionals to subordinate their knowledge as professionals to this need to think of the common good, serving the national audience, international audiences, and serving the collections which they're working to transmit. The second thing is that within the National Heritage Institute, we don't have any collections, actually. We have some very limited collections in the Aubervilliers restoration workshops for a short period of time. And what we can do as part of this dynamic is that we can work on methods around the history of collections. This is relevant to both initial training and lifelong learning. There is collection law. Vincent Négri leads this training program, and he teaches our students through his presentations the importance of heritage protection. He talks to us about the very long journey, imperfect journey, I would have to say, and he compares it with examples in other countries. We are interested in the example of collections, studies of provenance, and we look at this in our initial and continuing professional development trainings, and we look into the issues of looted heritage from the Second World War. This is a time where our institution took a very first look at these types of questions. The other key questions today is the items that have been looted or pillaged in other parts of the world, and we are offering a training in this area. This obviously needs to go beyond the borders of the work of heritage professionals and our national borders as well, because it's clearly an international question. I just would like to talk a little bit about the way that this subject ties in with the training of heritage professionals. With respect to the international actions that we carry out in various fields, so we work in particular with China, Middle East, the Caucasus, the North African area. How do we work? What are the key principles that we base our work on? The first thing to say is that we are still working with an imminently political matter. As ICOM states as well, we start from the assumption that what we're doing should feed into positive aspects of relationships between peoples, nations, states, and so on. So that's a basic framework within which we work. It gives us a means of working, and that's why politicians give us the means to do our work. It's because we work within this idea that goes beyond the issue of heritage. It's an issue to do with better relationships with between peoples. So you were previously talking about the dialogue between France and Algeria, which is a very thorny issue. We had the example of a conference around the heritage of the South Caucasian region, where you had Azerbaijanis and Armenians present together a few weeks after the recent ceasefire. There were words that were exchanged, but I wouldn't say that there wasn't a dialogue. And you can see that there is an intrinsic violence around discussions around heritage. We would like it to be a place of peace and reconciliation. So clearly, issues of heritage are linked in with very strong issues of identities. There are imbalances there. We need to be aware of that. But despite all of that, we are working within a political context. That's the first thing to say. And that means that we need to be very aware and understand. And this is a seminar subject that we've been pursuing over the last few years. We need to be aware of what the word heritage means in different cultural fields. There's a seminar that we've been running on this for several years to show that our French or European vision is not always the same. It doesn't certainly match exactly with the vision that other geographical areas might have, and that enables us in very concrete terms. It gives us a tool for dialogue, for exchange, and for cross-cutting training opportunities, and that avoids us making certain mistakes or avoids misunderstanding. When we put in place these exchanges or discussions, I often note that the biggest difficulty is around the expression of need, and that is fed by the expression of what heritage means in different geographical areas. So we need to make prior efforts as we develop this program and in expressing needs. What we note is that many of these needs are around the issue of the material preservation of the collections. In our respect, perhaps because we are the National Institute of Heritage, and we train heritage professionals, this issue seems to be much more lively than these more intangible questions. And so that leads us to the question which has been mentioned today around the digitalization of collections. This digitalization needs to go hand in hand with thinking about the material preservation of the collections in situ. If we don't do this, I've seen some examples of this when it comes to manuscripts in northern Iraq, where digitalizations were felt to be a miracle solution at the time when ISIS was coming through northern Iraq and was burning down library. But people said, okay, if you digitalize my manuscript without restoring them, without protecting them, who's going to benefit? It's going to be researchers in European and North American universities, and no one's going to come and see me. But if you preserve my collection here, I would be able to use this collection to put in place some discussions and dialogue. So I think there's some questions around the material nature of the collections, which interrogate the idea of digitalization. I don't want to say it's a bad thing to do, but it needs to, the question needs to be completed. Beyond this issue of the material nature of the collections, there are some issues around the fact that the discussions and dialogues need to take place in the long term. We had an experience within our organization whereby we faced some difficulties with short-term trainings that were too one-off and didn't generate dialogue or exchange. What we're trying to do now is to work in some key priority geographical areas where we could work over the long term and build up some professional communities, some networks of people who can meet together and continue their relationships and exchanges beyond the training, and who can form a common history. That's what we're after. We want shared reflections with we as French heritage professionals are really keen on this. To conclude, a question that hasn't been mentioned very much but is important when we talk about training is the question of language. We use the major international languages, usually, in particular English, and we're noticing that in our fields and in our subjects, the effort of translation, we note what an effort that ICOM makes to ensure that its meetings are translated. There is an issue around the lexicon that we use, the languages that we use, the interpreting capacities are important. We are starting a significant cooperation project with Armenian professionals, and we are ensuring that the work is being translated into Armenian because we need to do that in order to do that. We're working on a French-Chinese lexicon of heritage. We're trying to do the same thing for Arabic. All of this should enable us to improve the training offer and our exchanges in order to be the best stewards of the objects which aren't our property, best stewards possible.
Cher Emmanuel Kasarhérou, Président du...
Dear Emmanuel Kasarhérou, President of the Jacques Chirac Branly Museum, I would like you to tell us how your museum positions itself in this dialogue. Thank you very much. I believe that a lot has already been said, and I'm delighted for this. Allow me to start by saying that dialogue is never imposed, it is proposed. And I believe that the first step is to learn how to listen. It seems very simple, but as professionals, when we are talking to people, we tend to submerge them in our knowledge, and dialogue becomes a monologue. This step of listening is very important. It also should change how we discuss in our transcultural conversations, how we discuss the very matter of dialogue. Dialogue is listening, proposing, and it's also, as we have said many times, a shared foundation. It's semantics that can be spread around. As Charles just mentioned, that language is a fascinating issue, and in museums, I do not believe that we can reduce the matter of translation to a kind of automated machine. Translation always has a level of uncertainty. Every language has its own genius, and I do not think that we should eliminate these zones where we can dream and think of new things, instead of having a kind of automatic service. I think that one of the first things I did when I was appointed to the Museum of Nouméa in New Caledonia, where we speak French, there is a local Kanak population, however, that speaks 28 different languages. When I proposed a workshop that we would translate the word museum in the different languages, we very soon realized that we could be considered from outside and even within. We considered ourselves to be a culture with sufficient homogeneity. Museum was not translated in the same way in each language. Some went to the idea of treasure, some was a shared house, a common house, and some was about heritage. So even within a cultural institution, trying to find shared terminology always raises certain differences. I try to reduce these differences, but also respected them. So semantics is a very important issue, and I think we're understanding this increasingly in museums, whether here, museums in Europe. Felicity was talking about deconstruction to establish what's possible and not just provide a simple response. Perhaps I'll come back to that later. You will have seen today that the museum is committed to a number of different dialogue operations, where the dialogue is the condition for successful completion. We talked about Kabuti. We talked about Felicity's work as well. We have also talked earlier about the quai project. This work consists at saying that we are the guardians of a common treasure and that we need to move towards the original populations, whether indigenous populations, populations that have witnessed cultural transformations, in order to create a sort of interpretation which is not just a one-way interpretation. It might be multi-vocal on how we can interpret these objects today for the public. And I believe that this incorporates a lot of different practices. Storytelling is much more important than spreading out the entire collection. I believe that we need to have databases, but these are often created by professionals, and we believe that people in the public don't necessarily follow this. It's not necessarily perceived in the same way. There has been significant efforts on constitution of this museum to digitalize all of the collections. All of the collections are digitalized. This required huge amounts of work, and you're able to access this online. Since the various measures that we've taken to use these databases for all visitors to our website, there are several thousand visitors. Just 1% use the resource of the database. Databases are necessary because they help us to think, organize, and dialogue with colleagues from other countries. But these are colleagues that have the same language and the same passion. But when we're talking about the public and dialogue with the public, it's, for me, something that is essential, dialogue with the public. We need to find forms that are going to allow us to use storytelling and use the same language and a shared format. We've heard of a number of examples for collections. We've talked about a number of different projects today that have sought to create a kind of polyphony, to move away from this kind of unique single sound. There's a sort of polyphony here where we try to listen to different musics, different sounds, and that's what museums are there for. We want to allow people to listen to a sort of plurality of perceptions and knowledge. Sometimes as an antagonist, and we need to try and reduce these antagonisms. Perhaps museums could be a place where we can contrast them. And this kind of presentation of opposing convictions may be able to give rise to something that generates unity. In any case, recording natural languages and diverse languages is also a project that we have began, particularly with Polynesians, with the language of Tahiti, and also the Wayana languages from French Guiana. And if you go in our database, you will be able to access objects using what Felicity said earlier, typologies that are not necessarily the same as typologists here. This allows you to access and see that these objects needed to be typed, but it was sometimes a little bit cold. When they're typed locally, it's perhaps a little bit warmer, and it allows us to put objects together that initially we might have thought did not belong together, but we need to put ourselves in the mindset of the people who created them, and that's what is also interesting. For the collections, we have also been carrying out semantics work, interrogating, this is our lingua franca for museums, but this needs to be reconsidered. Perhaps it's a little bit too savant in its way of talking. When we are deconstructing the object and the historical meaning of a word that can be perceived aggressively by our public. So this is work that we are carrying out on exhibitions. I think, once again, dialogue is co-creating something. This was started by the museum in 2010 with outside of exhibitions carried out by specialists on specialities. The first large exhibition carried out by the indigenous population was the Maori exhibition. Their treasures have a soul. This was in 2011. The museum did not get involved in the synopsis or the storytelling, nor in the way that the objects were displayed. The objects were displayed according to what the Maori population wanted to do and the National Museum of New Zealand wanted to do. In 2013, I came to France to do a Kanak exhibition. This was a desire to present this culture, which is also an integral part of myself, but in a way that does not use the cold ethnological categories. I'm not saying that they're not useful, but when you're talking about a culture, it's interesting to listen to it and to use its own denominations, which helps us to sort it and to show the subtle ties that exist between objects, which would not be placed together within a typology. This was also a way for me to discuss the colonial issue cross-border for a country that is still a country that belongs to the French Republic, but is asking a lot of questions about its future. Colonial history needs to be discussed with two different voices. That is what we propose to our listeners, especially for our African listeners. The questions are asked with regards to Africa. I think that this colonial issue is a way of creating dialogue. As Emmanuel was saying, we want to present a history that is different, that is not linear. It was very different depending on the location. We were talking about the wampum from the 17th century in New France. The conditions of New France have nothing to do with what was happening in Gabon, Benin, and New Caledonia in the 19th century. The conditions were different, which is why we need to have two voices about this. Even for a single object, for a single event, we could recognize a dialogue, a place of dialogue in museum in order to present different perspectives. We did this again recently with the 2002 exhibition on roads in Cameroon, where we asked people from Cameroon to come and identify and define what they mean by heritage. These objects have come from their own museum. Very few objects came from our own museum. This was also a way of building constructive dialogue, which was mutually enriching. So these are just some ideas. I can see that we're running out of time. But when we're talking about restitution, this is something that we are working on very transparently. Once again, we want equality within this as well. And I think that this is something that has come up. And that's everything that I would want to say today. Thank you very much.
Juliette, vous voulez qu'on...
Juliette, do we have time to continue?
On peut prendre quelques questions?
Can we perhaps take a few questions? I cannot see you. I'm sorry, the projector lights are quite bright on stage.
Est-ce que le public a des questions pour nos intervenants?
Are there any questions for our speakers from the audience? I know that Chedlia would have really liked to have talked to the professionals in the room today. Magali Dufour, hello once again. I already asked a question this morning. I am a doctorate in PhD student in anthropology at the University of Toulouse. I was really interested hearing about dialogue, and it was interesting to look at the dialogue between different databases. Felicity, you presented a number of databases for Benin City, and then there's also the project, database project for quai Branly. You talked about Claire Bosque and her project on publication online of different collections. There's Joconde, for instance, Mona Lisa, that's being made available online. This is another project. Felicity, as you said, this requires significant funding. Could we think of a way of pooling all of this so that there is a dialogue between these different databases and to save on work and resources? That is an excellent question. For the project I was working on, this was a pretext. Monica specifically was thinking about interoperability, the matter of ethnological archives, but also Russian biographies that are sometimes built. And in the end, we're all working on the same thing without realizing that we are doing that. So one of my colleagues, Eleanor Kissel, informed me of a project called Espadon. I can hear Sonia responding to that. So we have a meeting next Monday with them, between anthropologists and museum professionals, particularly a colleague from Musée who will be present as well, in order to try to understand how they want to present this interoperability, if it's possible. I think that in any case, there are European instructions in order to make these databases interoperable, at least on a national level. The museum, Nanterre, a number of different actors, the foundation of Heritage Foundation is involved as well. And things are starting to move forward. I'm not sure, but I do think that we may be able to find a solution shortly. I don't know if anybody else would like to speak. Espado is a huge project, says Charles Personnin, and we want to have an augmented knowledge project. This means incorporating all of the knowledge that we've been able to obtain. You can understand the level of ambition here. We're right at the start of this adventure. But this has received financing from and there's pluridisciplinary teams are working on it. And we'll be able to look back on it when we're at the end of this experiment. But in any case, the ambition is quite remarkable. Are there any other questions? Yes, please. Please speak loudly. I'm afraid that the interpreter cannot hear the question. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for these very rich discussions. I am president of the professional network of museum industry and professionals. I work at the Museum of Natural History that we talked about. My question is for Emmanuel Kasarhérou and the others on the notion of polyphony, this polyphonic discourse. I understand your approach incorporating co-creation, which is very interesting for science museums. This raises questions. We have discussed a lot around this notion of polyphony in the first definition of museum for ICON, about a hierarchy of definitions and scientific acquisitions and knowledge, evolution, could that be called into question by the scientific community, for instance? No. So how can we interpret this notion of polyphony? It will be interesting to talk about different presentations and representations of the world and of life, which is very interesting to explain. But this does raise questions. Museums, for instance, that are presenting a creationist theory as if it was science. So this is a little bit complex to manage. I'm sorry if my question was a little bit long. I'm going to hand over to you for your response. Thank you for your question. I don't know if I'll be able to respond, but I think that in the examples that I gave, we can have historical sources, literary sources, poetic sources alongside, and I think the public will be able to find their way quite simply. With regard to scientific data, we absolutely need to make sure that, especially when we're talking about evolution, for instance, that we stay true to what we believe to be true. And alongside that, we could present other perspectives. I think that we could manage this in the museum with regard to know-how, or we're going to be working on an exhibition on zombification, sorry. Museum doesn't think that we're going to be able to create that, but the museum will explain how some cultures believe that zombies can be created. I don't know which specific cases you're thinking of, but we need to remain true to the idea that we should not place scientific knowledge on the same level as other things, and perhaps in humanities and social science, it's going to be easier to aggregate certain sensitivities than in your field.
Bonjour, merci pour vos interventions.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your presentations. I have a question about what Ms. Annabi said concerning dialogue with the community from which an object comes. How can we identify our person of contact when we're not within the same geographical and cultural context that existed during the acquisition of an object?
Chedlia, vous avez entendu la question?
Chedlia, were you able to hear this question? Thank you for this question. There is a continuity of context. There is a large continuity, traditional continuity passed down through the generations. This can particularly help us to find and anticipate and to identify the resources and the ways in which objects were created, their use, the why, and everything surrounded with the creation, original creation of this object. Currently, I know that in African countries, we have a big problem. This plurality does exist imperfectly. It's very widely shown, and this is what allows us to hand something down from generation to generation. We can hear you. We can hear you. We can hear you. So even if the object was taken 2 to 3 centuries earlier, there is a certain level of continuity, and information is always handed down from generation to generation. There are methods that we can use to facilitate our process, and we can work with people currently on the ground. I do not know if that has answered your question. But this is a link between the fact that a project was taken a long time ago and that today we are going to be working in a different context, but with people with whom there is a continuity. Thank you very much. Let's take one last question. Juliette.
On nous coupe. Plus personne.
Nobody appears to. Yes, okay, there is one more question. Could I ask a question? Asks Chedlia. This question is coming from the floor. Thank you very much for your answer. I think it's very difficult not to be caught up in current political activities. There are political stakes that go beyond what we're doing, and it's difficult. We are always subjected to politics, and we have to work within that system. But how can we make sure that we are not actors in political stakes that go beyond us, and to be caught in things that really go beyond us? I think that I could give a number of answers. I do not think that there's an ideal period during which we can work, and I think that we are working with humans, so there is always going to be sensitivity and there is always going to be politics. That's what Charles was saying. We're always going to be working with politics. But I believe it's the museum's role to determine the right moment, the right contact people, to not be instrumentalized by an exhibition plan that is going to show something on vogue in a country or another. That is our challenge. And I believe that dialogue is knowing how to listen, how to hear, and to perceive at which moment we can do something, or if we shouldn't do something, maybe it's just not the right time. I would like to give a number of exhibitions with so many countries, but we sense with some countries that it's not the right moment. So perhaps in 25 or 30 years, or even later, it will be possible. We shouldn't be afraid of that. We need to gauge the situation and then make choices. I can perhaps add to what has been said or give my perspective on this. I believe that it's not necessarily a matter of subject, because we are sometimes scared of controversial subjects, but I think it's a matter of tone. And I think that the museum is a unique medium that should respect its unique features and difficulties. We are perhaps slower than a journalistic medium, but we can work in greater depth on subjects. So I think that that's the real question. It's about not moving too quickly to do something on vogue. Instead, we need to retain these somewhat laborious methods from the museum sector. We are not a news network. We never will be. So we don't want to be running behind events, but cutting edge, burning issues can be used. There isn't a problem with that. Sometimes we can end up facing difficulties. Musem historically cancelled an exhibition on Odessa. It probably will not be feasible immediately because Ukrainian loans were unable to be transported since 2014. The transport companies refused, so there was no possibility of doing this. So we may sometimes be faced with this kind of situation, but it's about working methods that we need to be intransient.
Si vous le voulez bien, on va clore cette session.
We are now going to wrap up this session on the challenge of dialogue. Thank you very much for coming.
Nous déclarons ouverte l'Assemblée générale.
We are now going to declare the General Assembly open of ICOM France.